Can you hear me? Hear me now? Okay, I'd like to talk about our speaker who we've got to make a presentation tonight. Her name is Jonna Perrillo, and she's been an education historian and a professor of English education at the University of Texas at El Paso since 2005. Her scholarship focuses on the history of schools and citizenship, both in the sense of how schools define and translate citizenship values and how they enfranchise or disenfranchise students and teachers. She is the author of 2 books, Uncivil Rights, Teachers, Unions, and the Battle for School Equity, and Educating the Enemy, Teaching Nazis and Mexicans in the Cold War Borderlands, which she'll be speaking on tonight. Both are out of University of Chicago Press. The 4th chapter of Educating the Enemy was awarded the Bolton Cutter Prize from the Western History Association this fall. She also writes opinion pieces advocating for school equity and reform issues and has been published in the Boston Review, Washington Post, Education Week, El Paso Matters, the El Paso Times, and a number of national teachers' publications. Her interviews with journalists on educating the enemy have appeared in the Texas Standard and Time magazine. And so we're very happy to have Jonna come out and speak with us. I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk. So would you welcome Jonna? I will close this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much to Garland and Dennis for inviting me here to speak with you all tonight. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes about what my book is about and how I wrote it. And then I often get a lot of questions. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and I'm happy to answer however and whatever questions you have. And then you saw that's my daughter out in the hall, Frances, with books, if anyone would like a signed copy. Let me figure out how to use this here. There we go. Okay. So my book let me say before I even get into what the book is about, a note on the title and the use of the word Nazi in the title. Yikes. Yeah. Not sure what happened. Okay. I think it's when you go in that room. It seems like it sets off some kind of electrical issue. People sometimes ask why I use the word Nazis in the title when I'm talking about children. And I make the point very clear early in the book that I don't think the children were Nazis, but I also think it is disingenuous to use other terminology because the reason why they were brought here is because of the work that their fathers did for the Third Reich. And so to just say German doesn't seem to me to get at the heart of the issue that my book is about and that I'll be talking about tonight. I refer to them in the book largely as the paperclip children, which makes sense once you get into the book and understand what the paperclip, what Operation Paperclip was. But the book starts in 1945 in one of the first acts of the Cold War, when US War Department officials, racing against the clock to outpace their Soviet analogs, recruited 118 scientists who had designed the V-2 missile for Hitler and the Third Reich to build an American weapon under a program called Operation Paperclip. The site chosen for them to conduct their work was Fort Bliss, and the team of 118 scientists started to arrive in late 1945. To make the operation successful and to earn and keep the scientists that they wanted, American military personnel realized that they need to allow each scientist to bring 3 family members. Although in actuality, many brought more because many had more than 3 children alone. Those families started to relocate to El Paso in the spring of, or late 1946, I'm sorry. And this picture that you see here, which I got just down the road at NMSU and their special collections, is of a group of mothers and children arriving by train. They took a boat to Hoboken, New Jersey, and then took the train across country. So for 3 years until the group was relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, where they would help to build NASA eventually, the families lived in barracks surrounded by barbed wire at Fort Bliss. The children were bused daily to El Paso schools by military police. And in the most basic way, Educating the Enemy asks, what did it mean for the children of fascists to attend public school in El Paso? How did this experience change them? And even more importantly, what did their presence reveal about El Paso schools in American society? And that's really, that last question is really at the heart of the book. From there, the book captures a tale of segregation, education inequity, and a patriotic curriculum that heralded white privilege and achievement, all of which conflicted with the period's simultaneous intense focus on what educators called democratic education. So Mexican American El Pasoans comprised well over half of the city's school population, yet the paperclip children would come to know virtually none of them. These class pictures from Alamo and Crockett Elementary schools, the latter of which was the school to take in the greatest number of paperclip children, capture the segregationist nature of schooling in El Paso. Alamo Elementary, like all the schools in South El Paso, was called a Mexican school by educators, journalists, and residents, while schools that served white students were called American schools. And this nomenclature, which Anglos used across the Southwest, including here in Las Cruces, itself reveals much about how white Americans conceived of the relationship between schools, race, and citizenship, both in terms of how schools saw the children in their midst and how they envisioned their responsibility to those children. So as white people, the paperclip children were assigned to American schools. And this is just the first way in which the children of fascists were treated by white El Pasoans as more welcome and more potentially American than actual American citizens. At the same time, the paperclip children were exploited, and here I use the term that the Army used to describe the nature of their father's work. They talked about exploiting the scientists all the time. But the paperclip children too were exploited to testify to the power of American public schooling and American democracy. So if the children of Nazis could be made into Democrats, the argument went, anyone could. Because of this, I argue, the children were in many ways the most important members of the operation, for they and their ability to match images of what happy American children were supposed to look like made the controversial military program palatable to the American public, starting with the El Paso public. To make this argument, I investigate 3 main areas in terms of El Paso schools and school design, starting with school populations and student assignments. So here we're looking at a 1946 map of El Paso schools. And in the book, I chart the differences between schools on the south side of the sort of bold-faced line and schools on the north side of it. El Paso policy stated that while only Anglo students, and let me say, this is probably goes without saying, but while African American students were segregated by Jim Crow by law, right? Segregation worked quite differently for Mexican American students who were equally segregated oftentimes, but it happened through local zoning and transfer policies rather than by state law. So El Paso policy stated that while only white students could transfer from the South Side schools to North Side schools, only Mexican American students could transfer from North to South Side schools. Why? Well, because school buildings in South El Paso schools were so overcrowded that students took classes in hallways and in auditoriums that were partitioned into multiple classrooms. Southside schools could lack libraries and cafeterias, and students there only attended school for half a day. And this meant, of course, they didn't have a cafeteria, that they also didn't have a lunch program, as other schools did. When parents at Burleson School in South El Paso confronted school superintendent A.H. Huey about it, and about why Northside schools got improvements before they did, he called them communists and left the room. So unearthing these differences was important in proving that El Paso school segregation wasn't simply a product of neighborhood segregation, as was often said, but was in fact served a distinct purposeful arm of race and class hierarchy in the city. I show how these policies were echoed in other public spaces. So here we see a paperclip family enjoying the swimming pool at Fort Bliss, and Helga Chinkel, the little girl in the photo who I interviewed, told me we would make a daily trek to the swimming pool where we'd mix with the American soldiers who often lived on the base. They were very friendly to us, and I remember getting tossed from one to another through the air. I thought this was an interesting memory. It was one that actually echoed with a number of other people that I spoke with as well. Not so much getting tossed, but playing with the soldiers in the pool. And of course, these soldiers were white soldiers, because African-American soldiers were only allowed to use the pool on the day before it was drained on base, much as like in Germany, they were not allowed to use the pools, the army pools there either, the military pools. And I'm happy to talk about this later. People have questions about it. There were really mixed opinions among veterans about having these people living on base and eating with them and working with them right after they had just come back from the war themselves. I include this pool of the Armijo pool. I really love it. I mean, for one thing, it reminds us that segregated places could nevertheless still be places of joy. But it does also remind me of something that Mexican American students or youth, I'm sorry, had that African Americans didn't have, which is they did not have access to a public pool in El Paso until the late 1950s. So to even have this pool, segregated or not, was something of an achievement. I also examined housing and housing policies, including racialized home loan policies that some folks in here might be familiar with, that were used to, in the language of the policies themselves, contain the Mexican American population. So if you've ever heard of the homeowners loan corporation maps, right? This is what we're talking about, these kinds of redlining policies in which, and I've read the reports that went along with them. And in fact, I'm actually writing the entry report for the El Paso one for the website that is digitizing them all. Talked about the ways in which Mexican Americans were a drain on the city system. So my goal here is to understand how El Paso's entire civic and economic structure simultaneously stemmed from and supported unequal schools. And then finally, I look at two areas of the humanities curriculum, starting with civics education or social studies, whatever you know it as, and a series of units in El Paso schools written by teachers on cowboys and Indians. So here I argue that both in school and in juvenile culture, children were taught that the settling of the American West constituted a heroic narrative of white achievement, one from which Mexican American and Native Americans were largely erased, and in which genocide was largely overlooked. So the effect was to teach young white Americans that the nation's settlement and their own position in society was a result of civic virtues, including independence, industry, loyalty, hard work, that they easily learned in school, and that other children, non-white children, did not, rather than from a history of violence and conquest. It's pretty incredible that one of the people that I talked to still had this photo from his schoolwork. I'll talk about it a little bit, or this drawing from his schoolwork at Crockett. And I'll talk about it a little bit more when I talk about how I wrote the book. But I would just say that it very much echoed some of the themes in these lessons, including its absence of vaqueros and its primitivizing of Indigenous people. And then I show that because of Germans' longstanding adoration of cowboy and Indian stories, which some of you all may be familiar with, and the influence of these stories on Nazi ideology. So Hitler really looked to indigenous genocide as a model and talked about it quite a bit, and thought that Karl May, who is a pretty well-known German writer who wrote stories of the American West, even though he hadn't been to the United States until right before he died. They were very James Fenimore Cooper-esque type books, and Hitler ordered them all taught in schools in Germany. So the affiliation was close. So the influence of these stories on Nazi ideology meant that frontier mythology made for both a very familiar and really appealing argument to the paperclip children. And they talked about this at length with me. And this is some of them. This picture here, the one of Bernd Seeler, that's right when he had arrived in El Paso. His father greeted him and then brought him back to the barrack. That's the barrack where they lived, and gave he and his younger brother cowboy outfits. So it made an appealing argument to the paperclip children and even more to their parents, who were much more steeped in this culture and in these stories than the children were. And it meant that El Paso was a unique place and unique grounds on which for them to assimilate, right? A really different kind of experience than had they landed in many other places in the country. So this is to say that myths of the American West worked as an assimilation tool for white people of many ages, even as they were highly concentrated in juvenile culture and life. And then finally, I examined language learning in El Paso schools, and specifically the punishment versus reward system by which Mexican Americans and the paperclip children respectively learned English. So because Mexican Americans' children's lives were so segregated, most of them came to school speaking virtually no English. Spanish was the language of their homes, their neighborhoods, everyone they knew. So I talk about how, and this is again, I think, very common knowledge for people, Mexican Americans who grew up in this area, right? They were beaten, slapped, put in closets, given demerits for speaking Spanish in school. And anyone of this age, and even people of a little bit younger, will talk about that with great familiarity. By contrast, the German children were given ice cream by their teachers for not speaking German in school. So this is a very different model of language education and bilingualism within the same district. So this narrative of paperclip children's easy acquisition of English, and I catalog that in many places in the book, supported the theory that they were studious, quick, and enthusiastic learners, natural Americans in the making. Anglo parents demanded Spanish instruction for their children, which looked in some ways progressive, but actually had more complicated roots. As Mexicans started to inch into better manufacturing jobs, Anglos started to worry about their own economic prospects and to demand Spanish education for their children. So teaching Mexicans English, the logic meant that they would be bilingual and they would possess a skill that Anglo children would not. And so I bring this up just to say that we have to think about the curriculum, whether it's civics or language instruction, not just in terms of what it means for children or meant for children, but also how it's very much a function of, in this case, Anglo parental desire. The final chapter in the book centers on Ilse Axter, a paperclip wife who began as a well-known Montessori teacher in Berlin, and then once Hitler banned Montessori schools in 1936, went to work for the Nazi Party. As a result, she made for one of the greatest threats to Operation Paperclip, and she remained a controversial figure and a problem, really, for the military until she and her family returned to Germany in 1953. They were one of the few families that was not afforded citizenship. At a time when very few of the scientists were individually known. I mean, Werner von Braun and maybe a couple of others, but really they weren't known as individuals. She was, and the New York Times was publishing reports about her, and this was an issue. So this is the part of the book that deals with the Holocaust and paperclip complicity most explicitly. She abandoned her Jewish students. She instigated a chain of events that ended up in her Montessori competitor being murdered in Auschwitz. And she went on to lead her local Nazi women's group, where she taught shooting lessons and lectured on womanhood. Upon coming to El Paso, she was hired as a German teacher at the Radford School, a private school in El Paso, but then she was ordered terminated when the army found out, which I think was before she even began. But she did teach the paperclip children illicitly on base. And I'm interested in her, she's fascinating, but also because, like many American teachers of the time, she held really progressive views about education and education theory while holding deeply regressive views about race. And she's interesting to me to think about how you can hold both these beliefs at the same time. And my thinking is, in understanding something about her, we can better understand something about some of the American teachers that the children encountered as well. I ended up having a very extensive email relationship with two of her grandchildren, Lily and Felix, who I quote here, and who live in Berlin and in Austria. And Lily says, in case folks can't read it, I'm not at all afraid about my grandmother's name to be dragged through the mud. Ilsa Axter was a heavy Nazi, and there's nothing that should be held back, no matter whether she was involved in the Montessori movement. And her brother Felix said, what I want to say, I don't doubt that my grandmother was terrible. At the same time, I, my brothers and sisters as well, began to question her function within our family memory. Blaming her was a way for my grandfather to whitewash himself and his Nazi entanglements. And so these conversations that we had over time really helped me to think about issues of complicity, but also, and what kinds of ideologies support this entire story and what threatens to fall apart if we start to look at it a little bit more carefully. But they were important to me too, because my relationship with the Axters also impressed upon me the way in which this story is local history for us in El Paso, but at the same time resists geographical containment and continues to radiate out to places, you know, on the other side of the globe. So this is completely unreadable. That's fine. This is how I'm going to transition now into how I wrote the book. And the book started for me actually with one of these local history volumes that I'm sure you all have seen and read about other places. This is my neighborhood. So I bought it and was reading it soon after I moved to El Paso. And then this is a group of pictures of paperclip girls, children. And the captions aren't super important, just to say that they repeat some newspaper articles that I found and I'm about to show you. But I just noticed them, and then the education historian in me kicked in, and I decided I wanted to learn more about them. I think my husband pretty quickly figured out, like, the caption refers to them as German specialists, and he said, I think I know who those Germans were. And it never occurred to me the school is 4 blocks from my home. I didn't realize that this history was that close. So at some point, I went and found some of the original articles that person was using in this book, or I came across them. I'm not sure how much I purposely meant to find them. But when I started this project, I really thought it was going to be a project about political anxiety, right? Like El Paso is a border town. It's also a military town. And this is the closest school to base. And here are all these children of Nazi scientists. And they're German and they don't speak English. And I just thought that this might sort of raise some issues for folks. And I think these pictures were some of the first things that taught me that that wasn't actually what was happening here. I know you can't read these captions. I can barely read them. I'm going to try so you can see. So these are all paperclip children. And the caption on the left says, which girls are German and which are Americans? On the playground, it makes no difference. And then the picture of the boy says, German boys quickly learned American games. And so the images of the paperclip children playing with American children who look so much like them, right? They're indistinguishable. And with the prototypical school in the background, made an argument for the easy assimilation of the paperclip children and the importance of schools in staging that assimilation. But it was the captions that showed me, again, that this isn't a story of anxiety, it's a story of quelling anxiety, if there is any. And so I saw that the press, in conjunction with educators and the military, were actually doing a great deal of work to turn a potential story of anxiety into one of Anglo camaraderie, connection, and even self-recognition. And I understood once I realized this, that the book couldn't just be about the paperclip children, but also had to consider too the children who aren't in these pictures, the Mexican American children who actually made up more than half of the city school population. So, sorry, lost my place here. A greater challenge than sort of finding things that I didn't expect, because historians are used to this, and often it's a great gift, right? Because one's first hypothesis is rarely the most interesting. But a much greater challenge that I faced was the absence and even erasure of the children in the archives. So I made use of 16 different collections, about half of which were in the Southwest and in El Paso. And I spent almost a month, all told, at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But in the thousands of feet of material that they have on Operation Paperclip and the scientists, the children almost never appear. And this is the case in archive after archive. And even when the children do appear in press reports or teachers writing or education policy or all the other sources that I work with in this book, their experiences are highly mediated through adults. So out of desperation, really, I started to turn to oral history, which I had had some training in as a graduate student, but never really saw myself as doing, and reached out and saw if I could get anyone to talk to me. And I did. I did interview Mexican Americans in El Paso, including Genevieve Gonzalez, who was one of a handful of Mexican American teachers who were working in El Paso schools at this time. The great majority were Anglo women who did not speak Spanish, but she was an exception. And I also drew on a resource that some of you all may be interested in, the Institute for Oral History at UTEP, which is digitized. You don't have to belong to the library to use it. You don't even have to visit the library to use it. And there are just hundreds of interviews archived there, so many of which were conducted far closer to the time of my study than now. But I ended up interviewing far more paperclip children because they have not been interviewed, and those kinds of archival documents don't exist. And they shared with me their memories, but also all of the photos and memorabilia and documents that you're looking at today and that you're not looking at today that are in the book or that aren't reproduced in the book, but I needed to tell the story. And in many ways, they're not in any archive, and they surpass anything that I'd hoped to find in any archive. So in my inquiries, I go back and forth between what the interviewees told me and what I could document in other ways. I also had to negotiate between what my interviewees could not or would not tell me, especially around sensitive conversations about race and fascism, and what I could document in other ways. And then I had to figure out how to construct a story out of materials that could feel fortuitous in their existence, but also a little bit random, like the picture that Henry Schinkel drew of two Indians, right? And so it was only when looking at school documents that I could start to put together these singular objects and this larger story that they were telling. So I just want to end by saying a couple of things about why I think this legacy is important, or how this legacy is playing out today. Here is a chart that I've created of the latest census statistics of the Segundo Barrio, which is a neighborhood in South El Paso. It's not all of South El Paso, but it's one of our oldest and most famous, and it's significant. And comparing that to greater El Paso. And you can see on here, right, a real difference in education acquisition and a real difference in economics. Schools in El Paso are not racially segregated today in the way they were in the 1940s, though they're not all the same. Some schools are more Mexican American than others, but there are no such thing as Anglo schools anymore. But they are economically quite segregated and quite different in what they offer to students still. And that aspect of them and where those schools exist hasn't changed. This map, which I showed you earlier, I'm showing you again. Oh, there's something very strange that happened to this slide on this computer. On my computer, the red X's are on the schools. But nevertheless, every school with an X over it is now closed. And those closures have happened really in the last 5 to 10 years, most of them really in the last 5 years. The photos here are of just a couple of the schools that I've talked about today, the Alamo School being on top, the Mexican school, and Burleson, the one where when the parents asked for better accommodations for the students, the superintendent called them communists. And so I present this as a way of saying that there are many battles for school equity today. in the borderlands, but one of them, and this is true, I think, for many low-income areas, is simply the battle for a school at all, and to have any kind of neighborhood school to attend. So I want to close by saying a couple of things about the ways in which I think that El Paso school history and the school history of this region really functions as public history. So while I was writing this book, and I started researching it during the Obama administration, just to give you a sense of the timeline, right? The frame changed so many times as American politics and American society changed. So there were the Trump years, there was the pandemic, and all the ways in which the pandemic deepens existing school inequities. And since the book has been published in February, we've had all sorts of schisms about critical race theory that you may have heard about book banning and censorship, and about learning loss from the pandemic, right? So this book and this history, in many ways, is constantly revealing itself to me in terms of its sort of importance and its frame in many ways. And I feel like it's not done, even though it's published and out there, right? Because I think the ways in which it highlights things are constantly new. But I will say that I think is my strong belief, and I've said this in many places on the record, and I'm going to be saying it tomorrow with a webinar that I'm doing with PEN America, that our youngest Americans are living in a moment when public schools and students and teachers are being tested, and when democratic education is under attack. And my job as a historian and as an education professor is to fight back with the tools that I have, and the story is one of those tools. So let me start by just reading again this slide in case any folks can't see it. This was an email that I received from a woman, an African-American woman who lives in New York, after Time magazine did a feature on my book right when it came out. And I received this email from her, and she said, during World War II, when one of my brothers was in the army in Oklahoma, the USO came to put on a show. The Black soldiers weren't allowed in and watched the show from the outside fence, while seated inside was a row of German war prisoners. That brother went on to fight in the war and earned the Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. I can almost hear his voice as he bitterly described the blonde heads of the German prisoners in their front row seats. So I end my talks on this slide to make a point about El Paso history as national history, but also the caption underneath this photo, and this photo is from that same newspaper article that I was showing you other photos from, says, "Girlish secrets, no national barriers." And so I show this both as to think about the ways in which El Paso history works as national history, but also to think about the kinds of secrets that our schools contain and are often allowed to uphold. I share this email because it was a helpful reminder for me that the stories of where we live can validate the experiences and shed light on events that take place beyond our city and perhaps beyond the people at the center of this book. And so I like to think of our El Paso story as giving voice to people who may never have stepped foot in El Paso, but find in our history, nevertheless, something that resonates and that honors their own experiences. One of those experiences, I would say right now, is the attack on schools that I just alluded to. To defend democratic education, we need to own its historic compromises, as well as its promises, and to have a very clear idea of just how much we're still fighting for and how much we're struggling against. And so in my mind, and in conclusion, I'll just say, I think ours is a critical moment to recognize and to own this story of that the children of the Cold War, Mexican American, Anglo American, and German have left us. So I will end there, and I'm happy to open it up to any questions that folks have to talk more about any part of the story that you are interested in or unclear on. Yes, thank you.
What percentage of the El Paso schools currently would you consider economically segregated? Are they all still economically segregated?
Well,
Are students allowed to transfer?
Yeah, you're asking to what degree the schools in El Paso are economically segregated, how economically segregated. And you're right, I think you might be referring to, so in the 1970s, there was a really important and famous court case called Alvarado versus EPISD that found that schools had changed very, very little since the 1940s. And that even though we had the nation's first Mexican American mayor, and he had done a great deal to desegregate unions and the labor force and housing, really, that schools remained as segregated as they were. And I thought that was really important and interesting, right, to say what's at stake here in these segregated institutions. The findings of that federal court case were that El Paso schools became choice schools, and that students who were segregated to the most Mexican schools were offered busing to the more privileged, more Anglo-American schools. And there's been a lot of discussion about how many people actually took up that offer, right? Like, for reasons that people in here may understand, most people don't actually want to bus their child across the city. They just want good neighborhood school. And I think that was what was really at stake here, and a flaw in the decision, right? And a flaw really of the 70s in some ways, that was the strongest remediation offered, most powerful form of remediation. I mean, now it's more complicated because anyone in El Paso can kind of attend any school that they want, right? But again, how are you going to get your kids to school? And what happens when they get out of school at 3 and you get out of work at 5, right? So a lot of the times the segregation comes from, parents of privilege, I'll say parents like me, figuring out what the best school is and what it takes to get their kid there. So I can't offer you a real statistic. And I would say things are different than they were at the time of that decision. But I don't think there are any people of privilege going to school in South El Paso. And one of the slides that I didn't have time for tonight, the show is those parents protested when those schools were closed. They cared very much that those schools were closed. They didn't see them, they wanted them improved, but they didn't want them closed. Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Yes.
I'm one of those kids that didn't necessarily get beat by speaking Spanish, but I was a student that was threatened regularly. And I am happy to say that I fought it. I would sit nice and quiet in the classroom when the principal came in and warned us about speaking Spanish. And then I walked out into the playground and said, "Ese viejo cabrón, a mí no me va a decir qué decir." And I didn't lose my Spanish, and you know what? It's good. I love being bilingual.
Yes.
But it was a battle.
Yes.
But you know, the thing is that in New Mexico schools, well, let me put it, in Las Cruces schools, 76% of the population is Mexican American.
That's even less than El Paso, yeah.
But the problem is that we're invisible in the curriculum. We don't exist. So thank you for your beautiful presentation, for doing the book, because it's important that we know this history. This history, though, still exists today.
Yes.
We may not call it segregation, but the fact of the matter is, when you are invisible, you don't see anybody that looks like you in any way, shape, or form across the curriculum. It's very damaging. And so you have people, yes, that have managed to go through school, get educated, and have good jobs, but do they participate in the system? No. Why? Because the system basically said, we don't want you. And that's still happening today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your comments. I agree completely. I mean, I've been really fortunate to travel to a lot of places to be able to talk about this book, including places where there may not have been anyone Mexican American or Latinx in the room. But I love talking about it here because there's always people in the room. This feels like their story, right? And that's really important. I mean, I think the other thing there are a lot of kids, or there are a lot of adults quoted in the book, like you, who were kids at the time. They were kids at the time. I don't know that you were a kid at the time, but who talk about that, but also talk about the social dynamics. Sometimes middle-class Mexican American students whose parents could get them into more Anglo schools, like the rare exception, and what that was like for them. But the other thing that you bring to mind that I talk about a little bit in the book is what this did for families, right? When the kid is getting beaten at school, that affects the parents, and they make decisions accordingly. And I talk to so many people who are 100% Mexican American who speak no Spanish because of this history, right? Because their parents would not teach it to them. Their parents were the ones beaten in school, and 30 years later, they were still, or 20 years later, living that legacy and choosing not to teach their own children Spanish, colleagues of mine. So it has such a multifaceted effect, right? And what children do and what their parents do can be so radically different.
John, can you hear me out there? This is Dennis, talking from the booth back in the back.
I can.
I'm monitoring the chat on Zoom, and we have a couple of comments. One is just a comment that says, we so appreciate this talk. It is so powerful in its message. And the second one is a question from Adrian Juarez, and he asks, there is some protection for the Mexican descendant population that was purposely written into the New Mexico Constitution. Given the history of New Mexico and several protective mechanisms at the socio-political level, do you think this could have happened a few miles north of where these events actually occurred?
Can you read the question for me? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, so given the history of New Mexico and several protective mechanisms at the socio-political level, do you think this, that is what happened in El Paso, could have happened a few miles north, that is in New Mexico in this area?
I do. So, yeah, I don't know. I know enough about it.
And there's a really great book about it that I'm blanking on the author right now and the title, but I could find a way to get it to a person. If someone wants to email me, please do. That's about New Mexico and language policy and school policy. Rosana Lozano, this is not the book I'm thinking about, but she wrote one about that as well. But again, if you just email me. But so yeah, I know enough that it was different, but I don't know that race relations were so different, right? And so there's sort of policy. And then one of the things that I argue in this book is there are interpersonal relations, there are individual choices that people make. And sometimes people's education experiences just came down to, the either kindness or racism and racist thought of the person in the room who was teaching them. And there are a number of teachers whose interviews I read in that oral history collection that I was telling you about, who would talk about, oh, I loved the children so much. I was always giving them food. They came to school so dirty. Don't ask me their names. I can't remember. They were all Fernando. Like racism reveals itself in different kinds of ways. And I don't think people in upholding some of these school policies always meant to be doing the kind of race and political work that they were, but I argue that they were. I don't know if that's much of an answer to that question, though.
Says thank you.
You're welcome.
You know what I would say about that? Yes, a lot of things are written into the Constitution, but they're only words on paper. You have to give them life. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And New Mexico is one of those places.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the paperclip children? Did they know why they were there? And how did they reconcile with? At what age did they reconcile with their father had done previously? The Nazis and then over here for the Americans. they feel like they were pawns in political games?
No, I don't think they felt like they were pawns. I don't think anyone ever gave them a whole lot of attention to feel like they were pawns. Like, I see the PR work that was done around them now, but they weren't seeing that themselves as children. And I've maintained close relationships with a couple of them who've read the book and have said, like, you know, I didn't realize what was happening, you know, as someone who was in it and as a child, of course. And now it all makes sense to me, which was a very generous reading of the book. And generous, you know, just in terms of sometimes I'm not really that interested in their parents. I'm interested in their parents only because it's their parents. I'm not a German historian, but nevertheless, you know, there are uncomfortable moments in the book where I think some of these children, the way these families worked is like everything that I've read about post-war Germany, which is there was a lot of silence. There were a lot of silence in families in general. So sometimes I would ask them questions like that and I genuinely didn't know the answer. Sometimes they did and just didn't want to tell me. And I opened the introduction, the book opens with a piece from a memoir of one of the scientists who ruminates on what he had done and what he might have done differently and the degree to which he should feel a sense of collective guilt. That was rare to have that kind of insight from one of the scientists themselves. But I think the range was different. I think the relationship to Nazism was different. Ilse Axter was all in. Like it was her worldview. There are some people who joined the Nazi party in the early 30s before it was required. There were some scientists who everyone else in their family went to South America. These are signs, right? But then, you know, of course, there were people who it was a complicity of convenience and of, you know, just working their way up the ladder. Like that was the way to do the work that they wanted to do, and that was the bargain that they made. So I think the degree to which they talked about it at all within families was probably very various, but in a lot of families, it probably wasn't much. And really it wasn't, you know, once they were here, it wasn't particularly safe or helpful for them to talk about it in a lot of ways. They were supposed to have been vetted, right? And what the US War Department said is that it brought no ardent Nazis over. Right? It's the military that whitewashed them. And so for them to come out and say, not really true, right, wouldn't behoove anyone, wouldn't profit anyone. Oh, okay. Do you want to read them, Dennis, or do you want me to click on it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for inviting me. It was nice to talk with you. And thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Jonna, for your excellent presentation. Everybody, don't forget, she brought some books here. If you want to pick up the book on your way out, please do so. We have our next meeting is November. Sorry, I didn't look up the date. I think it's the 20th. I forget. It's the third Thursday of November is our next meeting. And our speaker is not completely nailed down yet. So I will leave that until you hear from our newsletter on that topic. All right, everybody, thanks for coming out. Interesting.